Well, hello, Andie Marsh. How are you, sweetie?
I'm so good. Good to see you. Good to see Poe.
You know, Poe, say hi. Who's that? Who's that?
Hey,
Well, welcome back
Poe.
to the show. I think you probably ought to just kind of refresh the audience about who you are. I know we've been picking up new people as well. So why don't you just jump in with your background and how you ended up here?
Yeah, my pleasure. Gosh, well, the first thing to know is that I am one of the graduates from the Soil Food Web program, so Dr. Elaine Ingham's online program, and I've been doing lab services with that certification. This is my third year in business with my company Rhizos, and that's Rhizos, stands for roots, right? Root word for root. And yeah, how I got to this point is, I went to Texas A&M University, a very conventional ag school, and I studied bioenvironmental sciences. And it was basically like an interdisciplinary program that was in the Ag and Life Sciences College. So I got a lot of conventional like plant pathology courses, soil sciences mixed with ecology based stuff. So like hydrology, um, environmental policy, and that's where I first got introduced. I had two different courses on soil microbiology, so I got hooked on soil microbes before it was cool, before I even knew like about regenerative farming as a concept. Um, that was back in like 2010 timeframe, and I got fed up one year trying to find an internship with these big environmental consulting firms, which is where all my peers were applying. And I just called up this worm ranch one day that I had seen at a farmers market. It was called Texas Worm Ranch in Garland, Texas. They've since moved to New Mexico, but still in business, I believe. And I said, "Hey, would you like a summer intern?" And they were thrilled. So I went and interned with them one summer and got hooked on vermicomposting. We set up a few community gardens. It was like my first time growing food. I was only like 20 years old. And yeah, I just was hooked on like food systems from then on. So I got one of my first jobs just based on showcasing that internship with it was like a poster symposium, if you've ever seen one of those, like you showcase your experiments or whatever you did for your internship on this poster board, and then we had like a sport of professionals go around and interact with the students. And somebody on that board stopped by and said, "Hey, I have a buddy who's starting an aquaponics farm in Austin, Texas. Like, you should go check it out." And so I did, and that ended up becoming like my first job out of school. Um, but of course, the irony is like there's no soil there. Plenty of biology, plenty of biology. But I learned a lot about just like farming as a career, and I ended up having to supplement my income, which was tough. But um, I eventually started working for a company called Fluence Bioengineering, which I'm sure a lot of people watching might know because they provide horticulture lighting, and one of their biggest markets is cannabis. They do vertical farming, lighting, and so I kind of got that's where I got more of like my research science chops and working with scientists and learning how to design an experiment, conduct an experiment, collect data, interpret data. For me, soil, I was just like constantly trying to figure out how to get my career into soil health. And that that's where the Soil Food Web program comes in, because I had thought that I'd get like a master's or PhD or something to like try to pivot my career more in that direction. And the more I looked into that, the more I realized that those types of degrees were going to set me up for a career in research. But that's not really what I wanted. I wanted to be like an applied scientist. I wanted to be bringing what we know from the research into these very real contexts with growers. Um, So yeah, I don't know. I feel like I just divulged my a bit of my adulthood life story there to you, Leighton. I'll take a breath and let you respond.
Oh, that was beautiful. Yeah, I mean that it just the reason I wanted you to say it again is because it really is a very cool path that you chose. Well, whether the universe chose it for you, who's to say, right? But you delved into aquatic microorganisms, you delved into vermicomposting, soil science, and yeah, I mean that's why you are so good at what you do, and why I gravitated to you to do some of the most important work that I'm doing because I wanted someone that really got this bigger picture stuff. Because you're absolutely right. When it comes time to dealing with soil health, you're dealing with ecologies, not individual microbes or bugs.
Right.
You're really dealing with like an entire ecosystem.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. A lot of people don't realize that, and that was the fear about getting a higher degree was like, oh, am I going to specialize in discovering something super specific about a super specific organism and relationship? And although like all of that discovery is super important, and I'm glad people are doing it, it just wasn't what resonated with me because what I was experiencing was as like a young professional scientist, I would be sent to these conferences and I was just mingling with other scientists. Like there wasn't a lot of opportunities for researchers to integrate and create community with growers. And that felt very isolating to me. And so I knew that if I went back into academia and continued down that path, that I would have just continued to silo myself as a researcher and not be having um, like on the land experiences of whether it's restoring a landscape or helping someone really create a resilient business because of how uh, resilient their soil systems are. So even in the context of like controlled agriculture and these greenhouses and stuff, like all of this stuff applies, all this ecology applies. It's just whether we're recognizing it as an ecosystem or not.
Have you ever heard of soil taxonomy?
As like the nomenclature for species and genus and
Well, it's crazy. It's been around for a while now. I ran into a lady named Maggie. I forget her last name, but she's coming on in the podcast in the next couple weeks to really discuss soil taxonomy, soil morphology, and get a better
mhm,
understanding of like what it is. Like because each time you've changed the formula of sand, silt, clay, and organic matter, you have a different outcome, or you support a different ecosystem. Of course, everything is evolving, so that kind of makes it even more complicated. And the reason I ask this is because, as a soil engineer, someone who really delved down the hole of understanding like what does clay do,
mhm.
what does silt do, and when they come together, what does it all mean? And so that's the only reason I asked. And we don't have to go down that rabbit hole anymore because I am going to be going down that rabbit hole soon enough. But
Yeah,
I was really excited to hear that there's more to traditional soil science. They have evolved, which is in my
yeah,
great
yeah,
news.
I'm super encouraged to hear that. I actually now serve on the board of professionals for my old major, and so the intention of that board is to basically be a liaison between faculty and industry and like informing the faculty of like what we need students to be learning and researching to better support like where the industry is heading. And so for me, as one of the few people being representative of like regenerative agriculture and soil biology, like that's super important to me that the soil scientists that are teaching students are aware of like the how much more information we need, um, how much more integration we need
Mm.
between like what we know from soil biology and all of that soil taxonomy and stuff, which I did study that, but it's been so long. Like I don't dabble in that, but I know I understand that the physics of soil is super important. And you and I talk about like thinking about soils as like a three-sided Venn diagram, and we want to, you got physics and chemistry and biology, and we really want to be looking at the intersection of those things. So it is super important to have the physical characteristics of soil incorporated into students' education and into this conversation, but I've largely neglected it in recent years because of the emphasis on biology. And again, everything's kind of siloed out with the research, and we need to be like bringing it back together to see how these things are affecting one another.
Oh, that's great news. I mean, that's always been my biggest frustration with reductionist science approach is that you pigeonhole yourself. And it's great to know what this specific bacteria does, but what does it do in different communities? It all changes. Like, just for the audience sake, I hired Andie to do a side project with me on trying to overlay soil food web with DNA extraction, and it's a challenge. It's even further. It's even more of a challenge than I anticipated, and I'll kind of explain why. And that is that, all right. So you have a basic soil uh, or a DNA extraction because it really can come from anywhere. And Andie was kind enough to take the sample that I sent her and then do the both the microscopy, the direct microscopy, and of course the reports, and then actually take the sample and add it to the preservative. So when you're dealing with bacteria or biology for that matter, because it's not just bacteria, um, it's really important to stop it, freeze frame, so that whatever she saw, we're going to see on a ones and zeros, on a complete DNA suite. Because otherwise, it's morphing, it's constantly changing and evolving. And I won't go down that rabbit hole too deep. But bottom line is that after she suspends it, it goes down to the lab, and then we choose from a general primer called ITS for fungi, 16S for bacteria, and then 18S, which is more for eukaryotes and other multi-cell organisms. There is a lot of information. Again, these primers are validated. So there's been a ton of research that's been documented over and over and over again that says these are valid tests. Now, the 18S is relatively new, is a lot more complex. There's a lot more background noise. And by that, I mean, there's this thing called environmental DNA, and it's everywhere. And so, how do you screen out the noise, the background noise, so that you can focus on the information? And this goes back to what we were just talking about, is that in reductionist science, they're like, oh, we have these species. All right, but how do they perform in a community, which is what soil food web is all about. Is now is
Mhm.
understanding that, yeah, you have these species, and yeah, based on literature, we can say, okay, this individual species under these circumstances will perform this task. But nobody's gotten beyond that, like to say, okay, well, we have 4,000 different types of bacteria in this one sample. And of course, every sample is going to be different depending on where you're pulling it from. And then trying to overlay that with what we call large language models, where you can actually begin to suss out that information. Now we're getting to what's called pipelines. So the DNA extraction is just basically ones and zeros, it's non human readable. You have to take those ones and zeros, validate that the primer was legitimate, and then push them through what's called a pipeline to clean up, again, eliminate the background noise and get what the information that you're really looking for. Tons of different pipelines. Fortunately, now in 2024, there are a couple of different pipeline communities where people have spent the time, the actual what we call uh, code writing, to prove that or build these pipelines and then have other people use the pipelines to prove that they are valid. They do function the way they were intended to function. Because you could easily go down the wrong rabbit hole. And if you have an issue with your primer, I believe they call it primer dimers, which basically means that that primer skewed. It went sideways. There was something that went wrong. And when you plug that information into a pipeline that's valid, that's been validated, it will basically kick you an error message saying, okay, there's something wrong with this information. You need to go back and reevaluate or repeat it or whatever to get it so that it's correct. But if you have an unvalidated pipeline, now all of a sudden you can spend all this time and energy and money chasing a rabbit that doesn't even exist because it wasn't clean information. You're getting background noise. And again, with
Mhm.
environmental DNA, it skews the data. So you're not getting what you really need. So that being said, it goes back to what we were talking about earlier about individual species. And I work with a lot of different clients, and clients have these bugs in a jug. There's one specific guy that's isolated a Pseudomonas species that um, does have effect on the trees that he applies it to, but he's pigeonholed. It's like all he talks about is, oh, well, I need to see if your product or this product or that product has enough CFUs, colony forming units,
Mhm.
so that I can determine that this is valid. And my argument to him is, look, there are so many species that we can't CFU, we can't grow out in a lab. So just because you have one strain that is you can grow out in contact with or in a lab environment doesn't mean that you're missing 5,000, 6,000 other species that can't be cloned in a lab, and potentially going to provide whatever species of Pseudomonas you have with the other resources of a whole community. And so that's kind of why Craig and I hit you up about trying to interchange or weave this together to see if we could start unlocking some of that really, really important information for people. Because as DNA tests come down, um, we need to be able to allow farmers to use that kind of information. Because again, yes, it's giving you not one species, but everything that is there. Now, it doesn't tell you how they're all interacting. That's where the pipelines come in. Interestingly enough, there's a company called Mr. DNA, and what's the other one?
Like biome makers?
Biomakers, right? And they have a new program called B Crop 3.5, I think, and that's where they're actually created pipelines that do provide you with the next level of okay, understanding that with this group or family or ecosystem, you can expect to produce X amount of calcium plant available, X amount of phosphorus plant available, potassium plant available, nitrogen in other forms, which that's a whole other topic that we spend years going down. But bottom line, it's kind of information that is farmer friendly that can be used.
Mm.
Still doesn't overlay it with a soil food web though. So again, I think that that's going to be really the next level of getting farmers really good solid information about what's going on. And let's talk a little bit about nutrient cycling, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
So my general understanding is the nutrient cycle is that the bacteria are consumed by protozoa and nematodes. Basically, those advanced organisms are primarily looking for carbon. If they eat too much nitrogen, they die, they explode. So how do we better explain um, to clients that they are potentially based on the microscopy, the direct microscopy report, that they can expect to produce X amount of pounds of nitrogen over a 30-day or 90-day period in their soil? Do you have any
Mhm.
on that?
This actually came up recently in the Skype group that the Soil Food Web has for active students, and it's something that you and I like. I've actually posed the question before and haven't heard back on. but someone has offered up a way to estimate that, and so, I haven't looked at it at length, like their calculation, but it's basically like grams of bacteria to grams of nitrogen, like that, like a conversion factor to at least estimate roughly how many pounds or parts per million nitrogen you have in the soil, just based on the biology and not necessarily looking at the plant available nitrogen on your chemistry report, as the only source of information for that. So I'm encouraged to see that people are thinking about this in terms of, yeah, trying to interpret the biology, again, like where those Venn diagrams like intersect, like that's a great way to do that. Um, for me, like the easiest thing that I can share with a client whose soil I'm looking at that it's mostly bacteria and like very little else, which is super common for conventionally cultivated soil systems. So like your typical row crops, with even just like normal amounts of tillage, normal amounts of chemical usage, normal amounts of time fallow, like this is all normal, this is all conventional, right? Those systems just tend to have bacteria numbers through the roof and very little biodiversity. And so the message there is just that like we don't have the predators, to make use of the naturally existing nitrogen in the soil system. And there's a lot of nitrogen just bound up in the bacteria, but they're just replicating and feeding off of one another, which isn't the same as having these predators consume them and release nitrogen into the soil. So that's what I look at on my reports, is that relationship between uh, bacterial predators, including bacterial feeding nematodes and protozoa, to the actual bacterial biomass.
Cool. So it's all your fault that people are talking about
I
it.
guess. I mean, I can't be the only one thinking about like, that question of trying to put it in terms that people are used to too. That's the important thing, is like sometimes I'm talking about soil biology concepts and people are going cross-eyed, and like that's not good. I don't want them to feel confused about it or dizzied while they're looking at their data set. So if we can start putting this stuff into terms that they're already familiar with, I think that's a really useful way to go about it.
Star that question, Ken, that Billy just asked. So the the uh, the interesting cofactor that I've talked to you about and asked, and I'd love it if you'd also post that up. Can we start to establish a relationship of P predators to bacteria? Uh, I mean, wouldn't that help suss out the nitrogen cycling system?
Yeah, yeah, you would think. So like one thing that has become of interest to me very recently, and I noticed that you had Tom Landry on, and we're looking at some of the reports that we got to do for him recently. His soils are like a great example of a very stable soil food web. So the reason I know that is because we looked at his soils last summer, and then we looked at them, yeah, last spring and this spring, and it's maturing in a way that is very predictable and according to the soil food web theory. And rarely do we get to see something actually progress in that way. So it's really exciting when we get a star student who's like following all of the advice and the guidance and the theory, to a T, and he's actually reaping the benefits of it. So um, to me, it's he's gonna have like slight ebbs and flows with the specific bacterial biomass and specific protozoa numbers, but they're always going to be in relationship to one another. So as they ebb and flow, it's one kind of chasing the other, and that's what we want to see in the data. Um, you know, this 1100, let's say 1100 micrograms per gram of bacteria on his most recent soil sample, plus or minus like 500, that's like a good place to be, plus or minus like 50% of like a baseline. Feels like this a good sweet spot. And all I can do is collect information like this through experience and be able to have it as like a touch point for myself and for other clients to be like, well, this is what I've seen work really well in his case in cannabis, but like maybe that ratio is different for pecan trees or for cranberry growers, or you know what I mean? So um again, research reductionist science can only get us so far with like these recommendations of ratios. I really think a lot of it's context driven. So I pay really close attention when people return to us to do another round of soil samples. Like I'm tracking that data closely for my own understanding to figure out these relationships.
Nice. And yeah, I was so ecstatic when he pulled those reports up. And thank you for rushing them.
Oh
I
yeah.
wanted you on that podcast because I really appreciate you doing that.
Yeah, yeah, he told me he was coming on. I was like, "I'll do what I can."
You're the best. But yeah, that was in my mind. Like I was so excited because you're right. It was definitely like pushing that advanced successional soil system. Protozoas were going up, nematodes were going up, bacteria was coming down. So, and to ask this question because I think I know the answer, but I'd love to hear it from you on the soil food web test. Ken, if you can pull that one back up again, you have off to the left what's called a biocomplete compost. And the bacterial number for the biocomplete compost is, I think it's like 300 or one.
Actually, this one's a soil test, so that one's gonna have recommendations for mid-succession, but if you find the one that's related to his compost report, that will have the biocomplete numbers listed on there.
Yeah, we'll give him a minute to talk or to find that. But the reason I bring it up is because when you start really looking at disturbed soils, right? I'm a compost maker. Everything I do is disturbed. I don't have the luxury of allowing my compost to just sit there indefinitely. And plus, if it's not planted, it never really has a chance to start shifting in these logarithmic or multiplier levels to where you're going to have that incredible F to B ratio, and you're going to have very very low biomass. But to say 350 as a low number, I mean that's the minimum that you have to be biocomplete. But isn't that kind of dangerously low?
What do you mentioned the number 350.
I thought
Where's
that's what I
that?
saw. I thought that's what I saw as the biocomplete minimum was
For what organism group?
the bacteria.
For bacteria, it's a recommended minimum of 135, and I agree with you. I think that's really low. I would rather see a range on here. The thing with bacteria, especially when it comes, well, honestly, when it comes to compost or soils, is that we really kind of want to know what the upper threshold is, because oftentimes the tendency is to have way more bacteria than we could possibly need or know what to do with in terms of um, when it comes to nutrient cycling and stuff and the fungi to bacteria ratio. We really want a manageable bacterial biomass. And so a bacterial biomass that's like really really high is more challenging to work with. So that's why I would prefer seeing on a report like we want to see in a mature compost less than 2,000 micrograms per gram. And that's generally the commentary I'm going to add to a discussion document. But I only know that through looking at dozens, if not hundreds or thousands at this point, like literally hundreds of composts from different contexts, and saying, hey, yeah, it's totally possible for all finished compost to be below 2,000 micrograms per gram, and um, if it's 135, there's not going to be enough prey population to maintain your protozoan numbers. So really, a sweet spot is probably between like I'd say 500 to 2,000 would be like a sweet spot for a finished compost.
Thank you so much for clearing that up. And again, like for the audience, Elaine's protocol is designed on undisturbed soils. So she created this format based on, all of her work studying whether they were prairies or the sequoias up here SoCal or NorCal, or the redwoods, whatever. That was the foundation. I mean, that was critical that somebody go out and really start to say, okay, this is a target that we should aim for. If I was going to grow a redwood grove, then I would need to have a super high fungal level for them to be able to survive, let alone thrive, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
And so the crossover, and again, this is why we reached out to you, Andy, is because we need to now figure out, well, in disturbed soils, what do those relationships look like, and what is an excellent versus an okay? Because a lot of the soil food web tests, not you specifically, but others, you don't get the commentary that you provide. You get these boilerplate responses that are, I don't want to say inaccurate, but they're not keeping up with the times. And the reason I say that is because in the bacterial community, and this is another thing that's not talked about enough, is what we have, degraders. All right. So we have decomposers and we have solubilizers. Everybody pretty much understands that those two groups exist. But there's another group in the middle called degraders, which are basically the ones that break the carbon chains or break the complex molecules or um, not complementary compounds apart, so that now there's two parts. So now a solubilizer can get in there and pull off a phosphorus or a potassium, and the degraders can get in there and pull some of the carbon chains apart, and it starts to crumble apart down to back to the original components that were used to create it, because a lot of these are man-made compounds that pesticides and residues and stuff like that, that we have to deal with in the field. And so when you measure bacteria and say, okay, well, if there's a way, and this again is my hopes for the future, is that we can say, okay, this group of bacteria should not be included in the F to B ratio, because
Mm.
they're providing a very, very important part of this disturbed system, not this undisturbed system. And so decomposers, yeah, we only need so many of them. We don't want them decomposing healthy roots. We want them only decomposing organic matter that is dead and that is not really serving much value, as anything other than a future carbon source. And we're going to get into carbon too. I'm finally going to go down that carbon rabbit hole. But anyway, the end result of decomposition of organic matter is carbon, and that carbon is incredibly valuable in situ, in place for the bacteria, because the bacteria can use that carbon as a source to as an energy source to divide, right? So
Mhm.
that whole friggin' loop, that crazy never ending loop of, all right, well, how do we maintain the right level of bacteria, but also provide the necessary foundational materials that they need to continue to keep that balance. That so it's not, you don't have this up and down crash shit. You have what we call succession, like what Tom had, where things
Right.
shifted in the right direction. They didn't drop and then come back and drop and come back.
Yeah, yeah, and you said something really important earlier, which is, like, uh, in a compost, you don't you have succession, but there's a limit to it, and then things tend to just taper off. Like, your biodiversity will actually, this is just from my experience, like, I'll see biodiversity tends to decrease towards the, like, if you mature that compost for a really long time and you haven't used it and you're just storing it for a really, really long time, it's staying moist, like, you still have biological activity in there, but my understanding is that it's just becoming more and more of a humus and less of a super powerful inoculant. So it's just you're creating something different. It's not to say that it's a bad thing to let compost mature to that point, but it's basically this mineral associated organic matter with
Ah,
very with very little biological activity towards the end of that like process, which we need that, but just being mindful of like that's why the microscope is so useful because I can look at this stuff. I can be like, well, I know that compost has been sitting there for a really long time. Let me see like where we're at in that evolution. And what I might choose to do is use a little bit of that mineral associated organic matter and mix it with a younger compost that has a very vibrant microbiome, to get the compounded effect that I want to restore the land. So that is really important. And then in soils, it's more about getting to a point where it's truly regenerating itself. Like the microbiome is more or less stable. Like that's what maturity looks like in a soil microbiome. And even still, like disturbance is necessary to keep things where you want it for your target vegetation or landscape or whatever it is above ground that you're trying to maintain, because the natural process is to keep moving along in succession. And if you are raising cattle on pasture land, you don't want trees growing in your meadows. You want to that's why you use the livestock in a way to keep an amount of disturbance that allows that microbiome to just continue existing in the stage that you want it.
kind of like the buffaloes maintain the Great Meadows and the Great
Yeah,
Plains, right?
yeah.
So you brought up a great point, and this is another reason why I got so crazy and hot and heavy over the DNA testing of that compost is because, excuse me, my hypothesis is as the compost matures, you get more and more cysts. So
Hmm.
not easily readable under a microscope. But and I may be wrong. Like I don't know. But my like you just on the last test that we did, where I sent you before and after. So before was before I added vermicompost and before I added fish brew. I sent her a sample. Then I treated it, or no, I kept that sample. I treated it the next day or that day, just after I took the sample. I treated it with fish brew and worm castings, blended it all together. 24 hours later, I pulled another sample, sent those two off to you. That was before and after. Then I waited, I don't remember how many days, and sent you another one. And you could see the numbers went down pretty significantly. And it was like, at first I bummed out. I was like, oh man, I should have been sowing that compost like right when I was getting ready to treat it, or just after treating it, the numbers went up again. That's when I should have sold it. But then I started pondering on it, thinking, just because I moved the numbers, the numbers were still fucking sweet. I mean, it was like it definitely
Oh
a really
yeah.
powerful inoculant, but not in the millions, only in the high hundred thousands, right? So, so
We
again,
can't have it all.
right. So as me, a friggin' perfectionist nut, I want to have like the most powerful inoculant that I can produce to provide to clients, and so there's where that sweet spot lies. And I reel that back to a series of tests we did probably 2 years ago, maybe a year and a half ago, where we did blended B in succession, and I think we did 4, maybe even 5 data points on that. And it
Hmm.
really did show that bell curve of somewhere between 30, and I think it was 90 days was the peak of the bell curve. Now, I got to prerequisite this in the fact that the compost that I was using at the time, you have to knock the heat out of it, right? You got to get rid of the heat. It's got to be
Yeah.
in the mesophilic phase for this to work. But once it's in the mesophilic phase, and say you did or you didn't inoculate it, what you'll see is that those numbers will begin to rise to that bell curve. And it goes back to like, oh shit, did I over inoculate it? Could I have added too much nutrient cyclers and knocked the bacteria out of whack and then lost the protozoa? And these are the kind of conversations that I love to have with you, because you're not afraid to go outside the box and take a deep breath and look around and say, well, I'd never thought about that, or I'd never, anticipated these kinds of interactions or reactions. So what do you think? What is your gut feeling on to advise people when they're making compost and they're through the thermophilic and they're into mesophilic?
Mhm.
Should they inoculate? Should they turn? Should they just let it sit? Should they count on trying to hit that sweet spot of about 65 days? What would your advice be?
It really depends on the feedstocks. So, if you have a really diverse and balanced feedstock, recipe, then my instinct would be to just let that compost do what it's gonna do. Now, a lot of contexts, for compost facilities don't allow you to curate your feedstock recipe in that way. So, in those cases where, like, maybe you had a lot of greens going, a lot of nitrogen inputs, right? Um, and not a lot of carbon, then in that case, I would inoculate. So it really is, everything comes back to context and what happened before where you're at now. Um, and the reason I say that is because I'll look at samples that come from like pretty industrial uh, compost facilities, so that it's GOM, ground up organic matter, to use your term, Leighton. Very useful term to differentiate compost that is ground up organic matter compared to like a curated incubator of soil life. Like, they're two totally different things. So these composts that are GOM, the ground up organic matter, you can make more useful by inoculating them with something like fish brew, or doing a nematode extraction of a really biodiverse compost and applying those nematodes to your GOM, and that will diversify that source of compost that otherwise wouldn't have had a lot of biological value. And that's the best thing you can do in that context. However, I'd say if you had at least 50% or more carbon inputs, and I would also say, like, a diverse carbon sources, so not just one type of wood chip, but like, multiple tree species wood chips that went in there, multiple tree species leaves that went in there, then in general, like, you're gonna have a pretty biodiverse compost towards the end, and I really wouldn't mess with it. I know you like to tinker around with it, Leighton, but so you can argue with me on that, but I I,
No,
I
no,
just kind of stand by, yeah,
no,
if it's
no,
a
no,
bad.
no. That was beautiful, and I can back up what you just stated. Okay, but before I do that, let's talk about heat. Like, when you say you did do a nematode extraction, and you are working with GOM, that's just going to go right back up to 160 if you
Mm,
don't do something. Isn't that
right.
kind of dangerous to try to put these advanced organisms in play without losing them when it gets that hot?
Yeah, yeah, you definitely are gonna wanna inoculate gum after it's back down to ambient temperature. So, like, let that run its course. It's gonna go thermophilic. That's only one of, like, I'd say 3 very common reasons why gum ends up being, like, nothing but bacteria. Is one of the reasons is because of heat. Another reason is because of feedstocks, and the third reason would be moisture, like, just poor moisture management. Either inconsistent moisture is probably, like, the most common thing. Like, sometimes they wet it, sometimes they don't, sometimes it rains, and so there's not a lot of consistency in there, and that's going to give those microbe populations just all sorts of whiplash, if you will. So yeah, if you're going to inoculate something like gum, it's got to be ambient temp.
Or below 120?
Yeah, as long as you know that it's not gonna go back up, because
Right, right.
sometimes when you turn it, it will go back up because you're reincorporating some nitrogen sources, and it'll get into thermophilic range.
So the other thing too is to be aware of that GOM um, only will hold about 50 to max 55% moisture. It's too lignin. It's too cellulose. It just can't hold it because they're bound
Mm,
up in the carbon chains. So to get that stuff to accept moisture, on these commercial facilities, it's a nightmare because they're pouring water at it so hard, and that water gets down and hits that what we call the core, and the water sheds off on the sides and then goes down underneath into the bottom and turns completely anaerobic and nasty. So again, when I'm dealing with these commercial sites, it's a nightmare because I got to explain to them, hey, you need pit moss. You need something that's going to hold moisture, at least as close to the core as you can to cool the core down, so it doesn't just keep going thermophilic and doesn't push the water out and beyond where the water is needed the most, to begin
Right.
to be processed into hydrogen sulfide, some of these other compounds.
Yeah. Another
Yeah.
thing that is relevant to this conversation is I was at a conference in Oklahoma earlier this year, and there was a soil yard that had a booth, during breaks and stuff that I was visiting the booths. And anytime I see a soil yard or compost maker represented at any conference, I'll go talk to them and just generally ask like, what's the do you do any biological testing of your product? And I ask for a very genuine place. I'm not trying to be like self-righteous or anything. I'm just generally curious. And most of the time people don't know what I mean by that. And at best, like it ends up opening a conversation. We can talk a little bit about like biological concepts and what I look for in compost, um, and that's always nice to convey that. But uh, at this particular conference, the company was called Prairie Dirt Solutions, and when I asked this question, she lit up. The owner lit up, and we started talking about soil biology, and she told me that they had actually consulted with Elaine Ingham, and she informed them of like a slurry that they make to spray on the GOM as another food source. So that's like they're not even necessarily inoculating, but they're just diversifying the food source because their primary business is like every other industrial compost maker is waste management. So they mostly make their money from the dump fees, and so they're grinding everything up. But because they care about soil biology, they are taking an additional step to inoculate with not inoculate, but to feed, to have another source of like
Biostimulant.
biostimulant, yeah, to basically encourage more fungal growth and more protozoa and nematodes and stuff, and seems to be pretty effective at it. So I say that having not looked at a sample, but the fact that there are other options. I just wanted to point that out as like this doesn't have to be rocket science. You don't have to like know the ins and outs of biology. It's really a principle of diversity, which it's a principle of soil health, and it's a principle of composting too. Like you have to have a diversity of inputs in order to get a diversity in the biology.
So well said. So well said. And that makes me feel good that there are some of these industrial composters that aren't just living on the tipping fees and then just dumping this shit, because that's pretty much
Yeah,
what's going on out here, is that it's
yeah,
just churn, burn, and dump. And
yeah,
and when I first heard of this and saw what they were doing, I was horrified. I was like, oh my God, what are you people doing? But then you come to realize 13 million cubic yards a year
right.
come through these facilities, and you're like, well, what the fuck are you going to do with
What
13
are you
million
gonna do?
cubic yards? And,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
when I started thinking about it, like, all right, why isn't this shit being tilled into every single field out here? Because even if it's super hot GOM, it would kill trees and plants if they're new plants. But if it's properly used, like tilled or surface dressed like a mulch, it's not going to do any damage, but it's eventually going to break down and start to provide those carbons to the existing soil food web, whatever's there.
yeah,
Remember, they're all using synthetics, but it's a better
yeah.
way to deal with it than to not deal with
Right. Yeah. There's a couple of things that
it.
I'd like
So
to say on that.
yeah, go.
Thing one is for anyone who's listening, like the more you end up learning about soil biology and like the magic of it and like the value of it, the more you can start polarizing, biocomplete compost, biodiverse compost from industrial compost, conventional compost, and it can become this like self-righteous experience. Like you start frowning upon, the regular old compost. And the thing is, these these facilities are not doing this maliciously. It just goes to show where we're at in our mainstream understanding of what we're doing on that scale. And uh, the way to affect change is to just ask the question, like call a compost maker and say, "Hey, do you have a biological report? Like, do you know the biological quality of the product? What's your fungi to bacteria ratio?" Like, ask any kind of clarifying question on biology and just see how they respond, because I feel like that's the best way to at least let people know that the customer cares about this. They care about the biological quality, because there's it's low hanging fruit to take GOM into a direction that is more biodiverse, right? So it can be done at that scale. It's just that nobody's motivated to do it because no customer base is loud enough with this expectation that there should be better biology in the end product. So um, I just share that from like a philosophical, historical point of view. Like that's just where we're at in this journey. And I hope that 10 to 20 years from now, compost makers are very
Five, five.
yeah, hopefully it's sooner, right? But like I really hope that it's just like second nature for people to be concerned with the biological quality of compost. And I have a lot more to say on that. I talk about this a lot on my Substack, by the way. So if that's of interest to anyone. The other thing I was gonna say, you're talking about tilling it in and stuff. Okay, so I I agree with you. I think like GOM can be a useful source of organic matter and carbon and into these soil systems where we've just like extracted the fertility out of it, right? However, to make use of that GOM, that source of organic matter, you really need biology. So that's why, like, the soils that I look at from holistic ranches, like that are using animal impact to restore soil health, they're very effective. It's really incredible when you start seeing how animals have this ability when they're holistically managed to really restore the soil food web. But there's so many contexts where it doesn't make sense to have animals on the land or as part of your soil regeneration approach. And so the question to be asking yourself is like, what is it about animal impact that's really affecting the soil ecology? And how am I going to make up for the fact that I don't have livestock on this land? And that's where, GOM is a source of organic matter, similar to how manure has a lot of organic matter in it that's being returned to the soil. The livestock are incorporating grass and other organic matter into that soil horizon at the top, but they're also inoculating as they go with their manure, right? And that ruminant gut especially is inoculating. So that's why those sources of organic matter will break down um, in an animal integration context. If you're adding a lot of organic matter to a soil, but you're not also inoculating it with biodiverse compost sources, good luck. It's going to take a long time for you to make any use of that organic matter.
So again, I love the way you put that. That's eloquent. And put it into a different context. I'm talking about industrial ag, where they just kill and till. There's
Yeah.
no consideration and there's no possibility of even putting animals and regenerating the soil. So you got a waste problem. You got all this ground up organic matter that can't go to landfills. You've got industrial ag using all these poisons. And you've got to get rid of this stuff and you want to help build tilth in the soil. And if you build tilth in the soil, I gotta believe if you can get the farmer to push back or start to reduce those chemical inputs, the endophytic biology that is in place in those ground up organic matter should begin to evolve and should over the next 3 years actually come somewhat back to life again, longer term, way longer term than when you actually go about properly regenerating soils with animals.
Yeah, but these guys don't really tend to have the ability to wait that long to really see, like, nutrient cycling
Right.
taking place. Like, they're
That's the ranchers. Yeah,
yeah,
they're
so,
the
like,
wall.
you you really do it's such a critical point in someone's journey when they're interested in these more biological methods, and they're trying to strike that balance of tapering off chemical usage and introducing biological methods. You want it to be balanced enough so that they do have nutrients uptake in their plants, and whether that's coming from chemistry or biology or combination of both, like, it doesn't really matter because they're going to abandon all sense of change if they have plants that are have pest pressure and disease and deficiencies. So that's more the work that you do. And so I'm preaching the choir here, but it's such a delicate balance, and I really think it requires um, inoculation, and that was something that we've seen like on Kyle Moat's
Yeah.
uh, farm, like with fish brew introduction, and how impactful that can be when it's done well. So
Yeah, and again, so eloquently put and precise. Because there's so many different ways to take this information and perhaps go in the wrong direction. So again, kudos to you for laying it out in a responsible way. So here's another example of dealing with GOM. So Ecosphere Sciences, I know you're well aware of them. We've had them on the podcast about a year ago. We're getting close now to getting them back on with some new information. But that being said,
yes, please.
So one of the primary experiments I did when we had the muncher out at Peach Hill was to take fresh muncher juice and apply it to GOM. GOM that was, it was past what's called pathogen reduction. So it had already gone through 30 days, 6 turnings of hitting 150 degrees. But it doesn't matter. It's still going to just go right back up. You pile it up, it goes up. So I applied a hefty batch of the muncher juice on the compost and then did temperature readings every day for about 45 days just to see what was going to happen. And the interesting thing was that I knocked it back into a mesophilic phase. So it will drop down to, I think the lowest it got was maybe 105, 110 degrees, but it dropped out of 160 down to 130 almost overnight, and then down to 120. Then it hovered around 105 to 115 for about 20 days. And then it started to climb back up and to a point where it got to, I think it was 145, but never passed that again.
it was never turned during that time.
No turnings.
Huh.
Just stabbing. Or I should say temperature probe.
That's so aggressive.
So I was excited. I was like, wow, okay. So we just bound up a tremendous amount of nitrogen and other compounds that would normally volatilize and be released into the atmosphere. So
Can I just stop you right there real quick? Because so many, this is a bro science thing. No offense to bros out there, but like, people like to brag about how hot their compost is and how long it's hot for, and I'm like, dude, you're losing so much nitrogen, like, and you're killing your biology. Like, there's nothing all that cool about it. I mean, heat is a tool, right? And we want to be careful of how we use that tool, just like tilling is a tool, chemicals are a tool. So we got to be like really careful how we use temperature. So I know people here probably hear you talk about being careful about temperature all the time.
I love
yeah.
you. I can't say how much I love you for hammering that fucking point home. Is that when you get into those high temps, you're killing it. You're cooking off all of the nutrients that you want to hold.
Yeah, totally.
So I was all excited about this, and then I pondered the problem, and that is that these compost companies are all about reduction. They don't care about anything other than we're getting all this money to
Right.
accept this yard waste. We grind it up, we compost it, we reduce it because we want to get rid of it and as fast as
Yeah.
we can so we can take more in and make more money, right?
Hmm.
So as soon as you say to them, "Oh, I'm going to lock up your," and I think we've talked about this, the experiment I did with Agromin, where I took GOM and it was chemistry. It was a 0.501. I added mineral powders, lenadite, quicklime, gypsum. There was one other, stone dust, and then let it sit for 2 weeks. Knock the temperature right back. I got it right down to mesophilic after one application. It was hovering around 110, which is good for biological reproduction. I was going to inoculate it, but I brought the chemistry test back. We had a big meeting, with all the head honchos, and Dave, or not Dave, the CEO, looked at the paper. Was like, "Wow, you turned uh, a, a, a junk product into a organic fertilizer because it's a 4.521. It's almost perfect as far as a saturated paste test, right?" Well, their head production guy went, "Yeah, that's a problem." And so both Billy and I looked over at Dave and was like, "Well, what do you mean? We just turned shit into gold." And he's like, "No, no, no. You fucked up the bulk density and the pH." And I go, "Well,
Mm.
the pH would not be a problem if we continue the testing and I start to introduce biology to it because they're going to friggin' balance that pH right out. As far as bulk density is concerned, what's the problem if it's a little heavier?" He's like, "Well, my farmers pay for a full tractor trailer load. If I only show
Mhm.
up with 3/4 full, they're going to think I'm ripping them off." And I'm like, "Dave, this is long term. You got to get out of the short term thinking. Like, so what if they complain on the first load? 6 months later, they're going to knock your door down for more of that
Yeah.
shit because their trees are going to have exploded,
Yeah.
especially if I get it biologically inoculated."
Yeah. And this is
So,
what I'm talking about. Like, we need to be able to convey this information really clearly. Like, what so many people are like, compost is compost is compost, and I'm just going to find the cheapest guy.
yep,
And that's not the thing is like, so all of these composts are very different from one another. And we really need to be talking about what's the value of that amendment. And maybe we need better language. Like, to your point, calling this stuff GOM has been so useful to me. Because when you look under the microscope, like, and the chemistry reports, like, biochemically, this handful of compost that came from this source is so different than this one. We should probably be calling them different things, and really, it's helpful for me to call them soil amendments. Like, when I'm talking with clients, uh, I want to talk about soil amendments, because then that trains people to be like, oh, right, like, I'm amending my soil with with what I'm buying. And that kind of is a simple reframe of, like, it's, instead of like this kind of enigma of compost that I just buy every year and I apply to my soils because I'm an organic farmer. It's more like, no, like, you're buying a soil amendment. What's the value of it to you? And trying to quantify that.
mm, so important. And yeah, another thing is POM, particulate organic matter, and MOAN, mineral associated organic matter. That was the beginning, Andy. We finally got a way to define compost as a succession, because compost
Right.
isn't a product, it's a process. And we use that verbiage as a product when in reality, no, we shouldn't call it compost. We said, hey, we are composting and these are the products we have available. We have GOM, we have POM, we have MOAM. And then there should be a ton of them in between. I mean, I truly believe that you're never going to get biocomplete in MOAM. The only place you're going to get biocomplete is in POM. So it can't be
Yeah.
done. It has to have been broken down small enough surface area, and at least mesophilic, low mesophilic, for that biology to be able to take hold.
Hmm.
So right around POM, either before or after, should be the biocomplete spot or section, and or biointensive. Maybe, again, it doesn't have to be like rock star compost. It still could have some level of protozoa. And again, if you get them in there, you got prey predator working for you. So
Yeah.
say the bacteria do get out of control, the fucking protozoa will start dividing like crazy. And now all of a sudden you did end up with biocomplete compost, even though you bought something that was biointensive or even less than biointensive. So
Mhm.
again, like, it's like you have no idea the weight off my shoulders, because the first 10 years of this, until literally till like 4 years ago, having conversations like this, everybody's like, "What the fuck are you talking about, dude? You're another fucking language, man. Come back."
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah. Yeah,
So,
yeah, yeah.
moving the needle along a little further is, I want to talk a little bit about Catalyst Biomimets. Had the beautiful opportunity to meet Keisha and Casey out in Nevada.
Cool.
I was fortunate enough to be invited to do I was invited to do a workshop on the horizontal soil system, which
Yeah.
I'm more than happy to do. I want more people to use it. It's free info. But the interesting thing was, they asked me to do a lecture first, and then break off and do a workshop after. Well, what I decided to do was to go down the rabbit hole of soil engineering 101, because just building the horizontal soil system, if you don't understand the difference between sand, silt, clay, and organic matter, then it doesn't click. Like you said, you got to get the brain to click on something, so that it's now something that, oh, I'm doing something for this reason, not just, well, why am I doing this, right? And
Mhm.
the interesting thing was that prior to me doing my presentation and workshop, I got to attend their first workshop. They were there for 3 days, so it was their first one. I think they did two other ones after that. And listening to them talk was like, oh my god, where have you people been all my friggin' life?
Yeah,
All about,
totally.
yeah, it was all about diversity, diversity, diversity. And I can't fucking say that word fast and hard enough in my life.
Mhm.
And they're like, yeah, if we'd had more time, we'd have sent each one of you out with a 5-gallon compound bucket and told you to pick as many. I'd give 66% of you the job of getting browns, and I'd give the other 33% of you the job of greens, and we would not plan to use any high nitrogen sources, just so you can see how easy this is. And she'd say, I'd give you a bucket and say, all right, I don't want the same species. I want you to find me as many different types of species of plants as you can get. And
Mhm.
the reason that's so important to the audience, because you already know, is of endophytic biology. So you're going to have
Mhm.
biology on the outside of the leaf, on the inside of the leaves, in the branches, on the sticks, in the twigs, in the flowers. Oh, they talked about flowers, Andy. Fuck, I was like, oh my God, I love composting flowers. I wish I could show you my garden right now. I got
Oh.
6 foot tall friggin' daisies, all kinds of wildflowers. And 2 years ago, my landlady nuked it with friggin' Roundup, and now I
Oh,
got it back. Well, I think I told you, Kyle sent me out the
yeah.
most toxic soil he could find, and I did an extract and had that shit turned around in about a month. But
Wow, look at that.
now it's blowing up. I can't wait to fucking start harvesting some of these flowers and putting them in my compost pile. But
Yeah.
that's what it's about. So they talked at length about water as being one of the most critical components to heat management, and not in a way you would think, right?
Hmm.
Basically, what they were, uh, Keisha said was that she noticed that when they built their no high nitrogen 66-33% pile and in a big windrow, that they had a problem with the pump. It broke down, the thing started to dry out, and the temperature crashed.
Mhm.
So this goes back to a theory, and I've seen it in multiple different variables in dealing with high biology, right? Is that when you start to lose oxygen, so you're starting to go anaerobic, whether it's due to compaction, or whether it's due to overwatering, or whether it's due to biological oxygen demand, which is another thing that we don't talk about.
Mm.
That if you don't have enough water and your BOD is too high, what's going to happen is the biology is going to take whatever water molecules are left and snap off the friggin' oxygen for themselves, and release the hydrogen, which will attach to a sulfur bond. And now you get hydrogen sulfide, which is that nasty rotten egg smell or bad smell, right? So
Yeah.
do you think that that's a viable hypothesis about their ability to harvest oxygen off of water?
Totally. Yeah, I think that's why like bogs smell sulfury is like there's not a lot of actual oxygen molecules in a bog. So the oxygen that is used in metabolism presumably would come from water. So I mean that it makes sense to me, not being like a molecular
Right,
level scientist.
right.
But yeah.
So so here's another prime example of it. I had 250-gallon totes sent to me from Fish Brew, and I told Keith, I go, look, I need you to send me pea soup. I want the thickest shit you can make. He goes, Leighton, you're asking for trouble, man. You know what could happen. I go, you know what? I don't have a choice. I have all his clients. We had an accident at Peach Hill. I lost 925 gallons of fucking Rise and Thrive. You want to talk about a heartbreak? Right in the middle of spring when I needed it the most. And I'm like, dude, let's go for it, right? I think it's still cool enough now that it shouldn't get nuts. If it does, I got insurance for it. Because if you blow a 250-gallon tote of fish shit up in a loading dock or a truck, it's going to be ugly, to say the
It's gonna
least.
be on the news is what it's gonna
Literally
be.
biohazard. Oh my! Who did this? Who's polluting the environment? I can hear it now, right? So this guy fucking rolls up, like 3 days late. So I'm already going, oh God, how bad is it? The fucking tote comes out looking like a balloon.
Really?
Top was blown up, bottom was blown down. You couldn't even get forks underneath it. The whole bottom had blown down into the pallet. Sides were blown out. And the guy's looking at me like, you okay, man? And he's wiggling it with the fucking the hand dolly and shaking it. And I'm like, can you get it down off the truck quick, please? So he gets it off the truck. He's, kind of looking at me like, what the fuck is wrong with this dude? And I'm like, thank you. Get the fuck out of here quick. Hurry up. And I start cracking the lid, man. It was like a cat hissing you never heard before in your life, right? And oh yeah, it was hydrogen sulfide all the fucking way. And it just verifies the fact of how critical water is in a environment where you're trying to support high levels of biology. You just can't do it without it. And so to anybody who's trying to make compost, don't forget to squeeze it and make sure you're at the right moisture level. Because if you're not, if it's gum and it can't hold 70% moisture value, then your chances of getting biology are very low. You're going to have to just let that thing cook off until it becomes more like a palm, where you do have particulate size that can hold moisture. Or you're going to have to add pit moss or core or something that can hold moisture in that column. So I just wanted to pound that home with a nice little story of me almost blowing up a 250-gallon toad.
That's wild, man. Wow.
Yeah, you know me. I'm a little bit crazy, but anyway. So we've got some questions here, and I'm kind of feeling like some of the ones I noticed might take more than a minute to answer. But I don't want to cut you off. If there's anything else that you want to say about what we were just discussing, please, speak up now, and then we'll go to questions.
No, I think if the questions are about compost and stuff, that'll trigger some new ideas. But I feel pretty good about where we've taken it to our own devices.
Nice. And then once we get the DNA report back, two things. Number one, I'd love you to hop on with Maggie in the future, right? Because she's the one that does the soil taxonomy. And I think it dovetails everything that we were speaking about today, and how to morph these soils, how to help to push them in a direction without over pushing them into a place you don't want, like getting saplings in a prairie. You don't want
right.
So, and I think that she would have some beautiful insights for both your audience as well as my audience on better and maybe new ideas in some of these regenerative practices. And also, I
Yeah.
need you to push your website again because you do a wonderful newsletter that I'd love this
Um,
audience to know more about. So, how do they find you?
yeah. Yeah, I write on Substack, which is like a blogging slash newsletter platform, and the name of my site is Soil is Sexy. So it's a fun and free corner of the internet. I write on things that we've talked about here today, but also just kind of like the more philosophical side, like the perspective shifts that need to happen in order to approach um, caring for our environment in more relationship based uh, manner, you know? So, yeah, I share a lot of my personal experiences with that. I share about some client experiences. And I also try to provide at least one practical post a month to help people that are typically like I'm writing with like small growers and gardeners in mind to give them some practical tools to start applying these soil health principles in whether it's a potted plant or a bunch of turf or you're growing a small garden. That's the kind of scale that I'm trying to provide guidance for there.
That's awesome. And again, I think that you, me, and Maggie are going to have an absolute blast because, that whole like understanding that presently we totally, totally disrespect the skin of the earth. We look at it as
Hmm.
a tool to extract or to disrupt and build on. You know, what is it? Knock down paradise and put up a parking lot. I mean, that's
Yeah,
the vast majority of humans look at soil or dirt that way because we've turned it into dirt. It no longer is the Garden of Eden everywhere you go. So
yeah.
again, I think that's going to be a lot of fun having the two of you on as a panel in the near future. So looking forward to that one. All right, so let's go ahead and bounce into the questions. There's 7 of them now.
Okie dokie. Well, we'll start with the first one you had me tag, which was the first question. Does carbon affect these results?
Oh, Andy, you're going to love this one. So some of the more philosophical work that I'm being forced to do is breaking people's sense of NPK. So what I mean is that every time I get involved in a project, whether it's compost or fish brew or any of these things, these biologicals, the first question I get is, well, what's the NPK? And I want to bitch slap them and say, that's a very sophomore question. Like, that's stupid. That's a stupid question, but I can't. I
It's
can't.
not a stupid question. But yeah,
Can't. It's just that's
yeah,
been
yeah,
plugged into their fucking heads that it's all about NPK, NPK. Even though
yeah,
the vast majority of them know that it takes a minimum of 17, and I'm going to say almost the whole periodic table to really create the Garden of Eden. It had to start somewhere, so you need all of it. But that being said, I go, okay, I'm not going to get mad because you at least attempted to reach chemistry, which is chemistry sucks. It's a nightmare. If it gets out of balance, you're screwed. Chemistry is the only limiting factor to biology, right? So it's important that you understand it. So I go, okay, so MPK, let me ask you a question. Um, I like to refer it as CNPK. And by that, I mean carbon. Carbon is also on the periodic table. And we are, as a species, beginning to talk about it a lot more, whether it's biochar or carbon dioxide or carbon capture or carbon credits. So I think that you understand the value of carbon, right? Person, client. And they go, oh, I have been seeing a lot about carbon lately. And I don't really understand all of that. And so I go, well, you understand that plants need CO2 to live, right? And they're like, oh, well, yeah, I get that. And then they give off oxygen that allows us to live. Cool. So carbon is just as valuable as NPK. And that's why I put it before NPK. So CNPK is the way we should be talking right now. And they're like, oh, okay, all right, I start to get it. Well, so how do I add carbon? Oh, now I got you, right? Now I got you. Fill you in with some compost. See what compost is actually carbon being formed. It's being broken down into its simplest form of carbon. And it's a small molecule that can easily be absorbed by bacteria to use as a tool to divide. And the more they divide, then the more protozoa and the nematodes, specifically bacterial feeders, come in and they begin to consume these and release you free nitrogen, free N in your soil. What do you mean they create free N? And that opens another door. Now I'm like, oh, okay, so you really want to understand this. If you're a reader, I want you to read Jeff Lowenfeld's trilogy. And if you're more of a visual learner, I want you to rent the DVD Symphony of the Soil. It's only an hour, 20 of your minutes of your life, and you will all of a sudden have a whole new perspective on soil and dirt and the difference. And so they're like, wow, this is really cool. I said, yeah, but one last thing. I want you to think about C pre-NPK plus biology. And then they go, what? And I'm like, yeah, well, what was pre-NPK? What was before NPK? And like, well, I mean, we've been farming for thousands of years without it, right? Hallelujah. Now I got you. And then they're like, what's the biology? I said, oh, soil biology. If you watch that DVD or you read those books, all of a sudden, all of this is going to start making very clear to you about the dangers of what we went through with the Green Revolution and how we're going to have to, we have no choice at this point, start to shifting away from those heavy relying on synthetic compounds, whether they're fertilizers or pesticides, because you have to use the pesticides when you use the fertilizer because you've got weak plants. Mm-hmm. And, you know, in the past few months, since I started talking like that to people, I've turned a lot of people on to the fact that they don't need to use the word NPK and that there's so much more to this overall picture than just NPK. So I'm hoping that you can utilize that as well, Andie, in some of your conversations in getting like you did. Well, I forget what you used as an example to get that person's light bulb to come on, but that's what we're up against. If we get the light bulb to turn on, then all of a sudden they're paying attention. They're interested. You sparked an idea, or maybe it's something that they can take home with them and run with. So
yeah, for me, all I'd add is that when I look at one of my biology reports, and the question of how does carbon, where's carbon in this conversation? When you look at that data set, all of that biology is carbon based, right? That's what organisms are. That's what organic matter is. It's all carbon based. So the more organisms you have, especially more fungi, because those long filaments, the mycelium, the hyphae that make up the mycelium, that is so rigid and structural because of carbon. Like it's so stable because of carbon. So that high surface area that they're able to create, that's why they're the superheroes of carbon sequestration. So that really does translate from a biology report to like how much carbon you have in a soil system.
Right. But if I said that to a person, I'd turn them off because they'd be like, well,
yeah,
what do you mean fungi store carbon? It's too deep, right? But if you go, oh no, CNPK, now you start to hook them, right? And then you can start to say, okay, did you watch that DVD? Did you read that book? Now you understand that we could harvest all the carbon we need just by taking care of our own property around our house. And we don't need any machines and carbon credits and all this other bullshit that's just greenwashing and money grubbing. Sorry, I didn't mean to go on a tangent there, Kevin. But probably go on to the next question.
Okie dokie. So Casper is saying, any truth to the Jadam or KNF way of picking weeds in the morning dew time frame in terms of feedstock?
Well, I could go off on this, but so I'm going to state something because I think I know where you're going. If you want to do a protozoa collection, then you go out first thing in the morning before the sun comes up when the dew is on the plants, and there will be tremendous amount of flagellates, not so much amoeba, but flagellates. And so what does the gut of any living animal require for processing any kind of nutrient, right? You're going to need the bacteria to break it down. You need the flagellates to release it. It's the same thing. The plant stomach is on the outside. Our stomach is on the inside. But their flagellates are the foundation of how we assimilate this stuff that we put in our mouths and grind up, kind of like the muncher. Not ironic. And then the bacteria break them down in an anaerobic condition. And then as the bacteria are consumed, again, releasing these peptides, amino acids, the things that our cells can absorb in place, in situ. So I think that's kind of where you were going with that. So is there validity to harvesting prairie grasses and small plants first thing in the morning? Yes, if that's what you're looking for. And I'll pound that home with a short story on my cousin's husband, who was a chief of staff at an ER room at Burlington Hospital, big hospital, no joke. When he found out what I was doing, he had a glass of wine. I was drinking a scotch, and he was like, "So, what are you doing?" And I explained to him, I'm working with nutrient cycling, creating, protozoa and nematodes and stuff for plant health. And he goes, "You ever heard of a fecal transplant?" And I'm like, "No, what is that?" "Well, it's basically when we harvest your sister's manure and put it inside you, because we've killed your gut biome with all of our chemotherapy and horrible drugs. So we got to get your system up and running again. So the only way we can do that is to take the biological stool from a healthy individual who's genetically close to you and put it in you." And he goes, they often have to be done multiple times to get it to take. So he goes, "So you have protozoa?" I said, "Oh, hell yeah. I got millions of protozoa. I think my best one was like 7 million protozoa per unigram." And I go, to be honest, Wayne, you could easily, I could build a clean room. I could medically compost plants targeted specifically for human gut health or human health, overall health. Compost those down, make an extraction. I could make you a liquid that you could drink, a pill that you could take orally, and another pill that you could take suppositorily. And you could hit the whole friggin' gut biome from the top down and the bottom up. He was like, "Oh my fucking God." He freaked out. And he's like, "I'm going to bring this before the board. I'll give you a call next week." And then I never heard from him. And about 2 weeks later, I called him back and said, "Hey, dude, what was that? You were so excited." He goes, "I got shut down." I go, "What do you mean you got shut down?" "The hospital can't figure out how to make money off of that." I was devastated. I was just like, what the fuck is wrong with our healthcare system? Right. But again, that goes to show you that how critical protozoa are in any organism, any animal or human, mammal, whatever. It's one of the foundations of how we extract nutrients out of the solids that we put in our mouths. And go ahead, Andie. Do you want to add something to that nonsense?
Just back to the question of using weeds in particular, I feel like that's kind of a double whammy, if you will. Like, you're getting the protozoa off of the surfaces. You're likely getting some endophytes of other variety, not just the protozoa. And you're likely getting whatever nutrients are contained within the vegetation. And those weeds are growing for a reason, to make certain minerals available to that soil system. So I love the idea of using that. I tend to compost my weeds for that reason, so that I'm returning those nutrients to the land that they came from, because clearly that land needed those weeds and whatever they contain. So I think using the KNF methods in a similar way achieves the same thing. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think what you're talking about is JLF, which is the Jadam liquid fertilizer, which is amazing. And that's what so speaking of what you're saying, is those weed plants are pulling certain nutrients out of the soil to move the soil succession to make ready for the next group of plants to come in and do their work. So they're harvesting the nutrients that are most needed for succession, bringing them up to the surface, dying, and leaving them there on the surface for the next plant. So whether he was asking about JLF or whether he was asking about gut health for his animals, I think we answered both sides of that coin. So hopefully he's satisfied.
Okay, and we'll move on to the next question. So, how do we add these biostimulants and make it ourselves? Talking about compost.
Andy, you want to run with that one?
Okay. I mean, again, thinking about kind of smaller scale contexts, the way that I do it, just in my small, neighborhood, right, is I try to source as many inputs locally, and I also try to challenge myself to not buy a damn thing. Like I just make compost from free resources available to me. So it largely ends up like my nitrogen inputs largely end up being grass clippings and weed trimmings from my actual property line. And I will supplement as needed with some brewer's waste that I can get for free from a local brewery. I'll also sometimes supplement with coffee chaff from a local uh, coffee shop. Roasters always have lots of resources to give away. Um, and then local arborist wood chips are a very diverse uh, input for carbon feedstocks. And yeah, you just like respect it as the incubator of life that it is, and you manage the moisture really well. And don't overturn it. Like, you just keep track of the temperature, to Leighton's point. um, the moment you start incorporating things like manure, um, or sources of potential pathogens, like again using heat as a tool, like you might want to go that thermophilic route and really just uh, make sure that it's processed well. But for most backyard composting, it's more of an art than a science, and you're just checking in, you're using your hands, you're using your nose, and you're observing the decomposition process. um, and creating a relationship with the compost pile, like getting to know it. It's going to feel awkward at first, and you're going to want to turn to the internet or a podcast, God forbid, you come talking to us. Like, you're going to want an expert to tell you exactly how to do it. And the thing is, like, you're going to be so much better off if you learn. It's kind of like meeting an acquaintance, and forming a friendship with them. Like, it just takes a certain amount of consistency and getting to know one another, and then you start understanding each other on a deeper and deeper level. So just show up to your compost, even if you feel awkward and you don't know what you're doing. That if you do that consistently enough, next thing you know, you'll have this intuition of when it needs water, when it needs to be turned, and when it's ready to use. So
Well put, well put. And
Mhm.
back to Casey and Keisha again at Catalyst Bioamendments. They talk a lot about intention. And, I think my audience knows I'm pretty spiritual. I'm pretty, in tune with energy and the environment. And once you start to really put love and energy, like when you're picking or collecting your materials and you're thinking about how you're benefiting both the environment by harvesting these things that perhaps you don't want or need to be cut back. You're putting intention into them, and now when you're composting it, your what's it called? Jumping light speed, like what Andy talks about, is getting comfortable with a pile, because it's an animal, it's an organism. You need to feed it water. It's like a puppy dog or a kitty cat. You can't just turn your back on it, let it dry out and die. You got to keep it. Check the temperature, make sure it doesn't have a fever, make sure it's moist, make sure it doesn't smell bad. And by doing that repeatedly, yeah, you're going to just get better and better and better at it. So I think that's important to understand intention and to think about what you're doing, not just do it blindfolded and deaf dumb.
Mhm.
yeah, and don't overthink it either, because the amounts of compost I've looked at, from backyard compost makers to industrial compost making to like really niche boutique level compost making, like the backyard composts are almost always more biodiverse than the industrial compost that person would have been purchasing, right? So just a little bit of effort can go a long way in cultivating biology that you can then use in so many different contexts, and a little amount of solid quality compost can go a long way as a liquid, right? So I really encourage everyone to have some amount of compost practice. The other thing too worth mentioning is that the Johnson-Su bioreactor method is one of the easiest ways to create a very biodiverse microbiome, and it's very hands-off. It's very static, so that you just really manage moisture. I won't go into the details of Johnson-Su bioreactor, but it's mostly filled with it's all carbon inputs. And so you can end up getting a really fungal dominant compost, which is desirable for most cases. And all you have to do is manage moisture and just set it and leave it for a year, and you'll have a really rich amendment. Vermicompost is similarly like a little bit easier for most people than jumping into like the hot composting. But it just kind of depends on what speaks to you. And that's like, imagine yourself feeding worms. Does that light you up? Or imagine yourself turning like a compost on the side of your yard. Like, what is most convenient for you? The convenience is like it's probably the most important factor to maintaining a composting practice, is that it's conveniently located. It's convenient for you to put food scraps in it if that's how you're going to be doing it. You can also build a compost pile without any food scraps at all. So it's really up to you on how you go about it.
Love it. Well said. And just for, I've repeated this a number of times. I'm going to say it again. But as far as food waste compost, the best thing I've ever figured out was just take a post hole digger, go out in the backyard, dig a hole next to a tree or shrub or wherever you want some added nutrition. Dig it down as deep as you can. Start throwing your food scraps into the bottom of that pit. Keep some soil next to it to top it off. So every time you add a little bit of food waste, a couple handfuls of soil, and then put like a trash can over the top of it so you don't get squirrels, rabbits, and raccoons or any pests coming in. And then wait till you get to about 12 inches to the surface, and then top it off with soil. Now you've just added one of those nutrient spikes right next to whatever plants or trees you want. Easy, cheap, lazy, it's not going to take a lot of energy. Get the kids excited. And if you go back like 6 months later, you're going to see it's just crawling with worms. And those worms are going to go out into your soil. And perhaps you'll do another one and another one and another one. Before you know it, you're going to have turned that whole backyard into this amazing, Garden of Eden by just that little bit of extra practice. And now one other thing, Andie, I've always had an opinion about this, but I want to hear your opinion. Coffee grounds, greens or browns?
Oh, they got more nitrogen than carbon in them, for sure.
Even though they're brown.
Yeah, so that's why I like to think about feedstocks in terms of nitrogen and carbon and not greens and browns, because you have inputs that will look brown, but they behave like a green. And so being more literal about it as like nitrogens and carbon inputs, I find to be helpful. And for the average backyard compost that's processing food scraps, like, again, to make it really simple, like aiming for 50-50. So when Leighton says you add food scraps and then you add a similar amount of soil on top, the soil in that case is your carbon input. The food scraps are very nitrogen heavy. So I advise the same thing. I like to heap up wood chips or leaves to the side of my compost. And so every time I add food scraps, I can pull from the carbon pile and add a similar volume of carbon.
Love it. And distiller's waste or brewer's waste, I'm a huge fan of that stuff. Have you noticed that it's like a nematode inoculant?
I've heard you say that before, like calling it nematode munchies. And yeah, I mean, I guess I always see like a huge spike in bacterial feeding nematodes in the piles that I use that as like a high, and that behaves more like a high nitrogen, so it really does drive heat. So I think it's driving the bacteria such that the nematodes follow. Yeah.
Gotcha. All right, next question, I think, unless Ken, you had something.
Yeah. Well, other than, we grow plants and we know that each cell is developed by the biology, your compost is just like a plant. You're dealing with a life form, like Leighton said, and treating it as such. Proper watering, proper nutrition, etc., is part of the growth of the compost pile that's going to go into the plant that we want to grow.
Mm-hmm.
But the other side of Perpetual's question was adding the slurry to the wood chips, so the GOM, and generally take years to break down. Can you speed up the breakdown of the wood chips using a source like GOM?
No, GOM is uncontrollably high in nitrogen. So I mean, if your goal is pure reduction, then maybe. If your goal is to create a biocomplete or a biointensive compost, then I would say no. Again, when I used a slurry, a biological slurry, a food waste slurry on GOM, I slowed down the process. I didn't speed it up. So maybe reread the question again so I make sure I contradict myself there.
It's all about the you wanting to break down the wood chips, right? Which is
not GOM, but wood chips.
Well, okay. Yeah, he wants to add the GOM to the wood chips to speed up the decomposition of the wood chips.
What was the slurry part?
That would be your GOM.
Okay, so GOM doesn't make a slurry, but just so we're clear, GOM is like just rugged chunks of wood that have just been ripped apart and shredded. They're not even wood chips, right? GOM is like a tub grinder. You'd have to see it. It's like stringy chunks of plants and trees and you name it. So that's a big difference between like wood chips per se. But would GOM heat up the wood chips? Yeah, you would actually be doing a win-win because you'd speed up the breakdown of the chips and you'd cool down the heat of the GOM, so you would get back to a more pleasant C-to-N ratio or green to brown ratio.
I do know I mentioned a slurry earlier, and it was in reference to the soil yard that I ran into in Oklahoma. So they were making GOM, right, as an industrial compost maker, and then they were adding a slurry that Dr. Elaine had advised them on. And the slurry in that context was microbial foods. So I don't know the specific recipe, but I'm sure it included things like an oat flour and like other more complex sugars to drive fungi. So that particular slurry doesn't make sense to me to add onto a wood chip pile because the wood chips are the carbon source that is the fungal food. In that case, with wood chips, I would be more focused on either you consolidate the wood chips into like a Johnson-Su bioreactor with the air and you keep it really moist and you let that just do its thing, its decomposition, or you can use the wood chips and mix it with a nitrogen source to have a faster decomposition process and make a more diverse soil amendment.
And the other piece too is to understand the age of the wood chips. The older the wood chips are, the more punky they get, the more moisture they'll hold, the quicker they'll break down with the additional water. So if they're brand new wood chips like GOM, they're not going to hold jack for water, 50-55%. But if they've been sitting in the sun or piled up for a few months and you start putting a sprinkler on there and watering them, you're going to turn them into just a fungal maniac. You're just loaded with hyphae.
Perpetual just doesn't want to have to turn his compost pile. And I would recommend the Johnson-Su as long there's one caveat, Andy. I live in Canada. We have to have it indoors because it can't freeze. So that's the caveat. Now they have done it in extremely large high tunnels, etc. in northern climates. So it is 100% possible to do it, but that's the one caveat for cold climates. You have to be able to heat that, and it has to be heated for a year.
Yeah, that's a good point. And it's not that it's hot, it's just that you don't want it to freeze. Yeah. And I don't think of that because I'm here in Texas and it's just hot as hell all the time.
Nor do I.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and that's one of the reasons that they when they put it together, that you're putting in the watering system to keep it at that 70% water, like Leighton was talking about.
Uh-huh.
And in your heat, that's more important than in my area where it's not drawing that moisture off all the time, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
In New England, man, I could turn a fresh pile of chips into amazing fungally dominant compost in less than a year. And that was just pile it up and let it go because we had so much moisture. We had moisture in the air and we had lots of rain. So it really depends on your climate.
Yeah. So we'll go back to the questions here. And Billy is asking, what is Andie's opinion fungal to bacteria ratio upon completion of compost?
That's optimum.
Oh, sorry, optimum.
What's my opinion of the optimum? Well, it does depend on, again, context. So the context of the soil that you're going to be applying that compost to, that soil amendment to. If in most cases, we want to be applying quite a bit of fungi to our soils because so many of our soils are deficient. And again, in most cases, our soils are going to have a lower ratio than a 1-to-1. So that would be like equal amounts of biomass of fungi to equal amounts of bacteria. Like a 1-to-1 ratio is good for like most contexts, like mid-succession contexts. But almost all of our soils are lower than that. So if you can get a compost to a 1-to-1 ratio, that's great. You'll notice on the compost report that we shared earlier, the recommended minimum for a fungi to bacteria ratio is 0.3. So that's quite a bit lower than what would be 1.0. That would represent 1-to-1. But again, if 0.3 is higher than the soil fungi to bacteria ratio that you're trying to amend, then it will have a positive effect. So it's always that you just want to be applying a higher fungi to bacteria ratio than what's existent in your soil. But in these Johnson Sioux bioreactors, I mean, I've seen fungi to bacteria ratios as high as 10.0. So that means 10 times as much fungi as there is bacteria. And you can dilute that and use that to inoculate a large amount of acreage, right? With fungi. And so if you have a higher fungi to bacteria ratio in your final compost, that will also inform like your dilution rates for when it comes for your application time. Yeah.
So I would love to share this. One of the first forms of compost making I did was I called it a solar pile. So I basically start with old rotten punk log, a big one. And then I take brand fresh sapling branches that I cut off, new growth deciduous trees. I'd layer them leaves up, leaves down, leaves up, leaves down, and build a tent, right, of the new branches over the punky old rotten log. Then I'd throw down about 3 inches of hay. Then I'd mix my greens and browns and apply it to it. Basically a hugel pile. Now I'd have one side facing solar south, the other side facing solar north. And then I would plant the north side with little oak trees. I usually put a lot of acorns in there because as it heated up, the little saplings would pop. I pull up a lot of little spruce trees, evergreen trees, and plant that whole back side with plants that I'd harvested right around the area. And then on the southern side, I would plant wildflowers and grasses, more bacterial rich. And what I found was that I ended up with a half a pile of fungally dominant and half a pile of bacterial dominant. Now you got everything you need. And I mean, I'm still doing that same practice here at Peach Hills. I have like probably 10, 15 different piles that are different states of maturity and different relationships of F to B that I mix together based on the client. Because at the end of the day, what are you freaking growing? Is it cannabis? Yeah, 1-to-1. Or maybe it's one of your difficult cultivars, go 5-to-1. But at least you have these variables you can tailor it to whatever you really want for the end plant application.
Okay, then we'll go on to the next one. If you kill heaps of green material with Roundup, can you use the dead material in the compost, or will it be carrying the poisons?
Oh boy. So the only way I was able to degrade a heavy amount of Roundup. Again, my garden was an oasis of indigenous flowers, and I had this one little shrub that I've been nursing, since we landed here 2 days before COVID hit. And I got the little tree up to about almost 3 feet and super healthy. And then my landlady she texted me and said, "Hey, your garden's a little unruly. Can I cut it back?" And I told her, "Yeah, just weed whack everything. It's 6 inches, or weed whack everything. So it's 6 inches tall. Let everything chop and drop. It'll create a nice mulch. It won't be as unsightly, and then it'll all regenerate by the time I get back." Well, she round up the whole thing. I got back, even the shrub was dead. All the leaves had turned brown. The soil was bare. So the only way I was able to neutralize it was to get the most toxic grasses that I could get, that I knew had been in a field in the middle of Ohio for 50 years, just getting pounded with herbicides. So that means everything from atrazine and Roundup, you name it. And the reason that grass survived in this highly toxic field was because it's all about the biology. Those bacteria had learned to use Roundup and its other various compounds, because glyphosate is the least toxic ingredient in that fucking product. It's the least toxic. You should see how toxic the other ones are that they won't talk about. So if you can find a place that a heavy ag that's been all chemical forever, find a clump of grass around the edge of the field that's thriving, pull it up. You want to get the whole root ball, the whole grass, the whole thing. Even if you got to shovel it up, get the root clod. Take the root clod, put it in a bucket of water, shake it repeatedly, vibrate it, whatever you have to do to separate all the soil off of the root ball. That's called rhizosphere extraction. So you're literally extracting the living organisms off the roots without disturbing the roots or destroying them. Potential extraction or complete extraction of those organisms. So once you've got your chocolate water, gently pour the water off of the top so that you're not dumping the sand, silt, and clay that have attached to the root as well. You just want the liquid. So you're going to have to wash the gravel and the sand a little bit, spin it around like a gold pan, pour it off till you've gotten all the chocolate water out of the sand, silt, and clay. Dump that somewhere, and now take that liquid, watering can, any other way you can get it to apply to that Roundup infected area. If it's large scale, well, you think large. If it's small scale, then you can think small. But that's the only way that I've figured out how to degrade and decompose the effects of that particular chemical.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is that if you're using it as a source of greens and you're going to be composting it, like that it contains this toxin on that feedstock source. Same thing with like manures that come from animals that had a lot of like dewormers and other vaccines and stuff. Like sometimes that's like intended to suppress biology, right? So we just want to be mindful of the ratios of that particular input in the greater compost pile, because a compost can deal with it, but not if it's like all of your greens, or like over 50% of your greens. Like you kind of want to be able to ration it out. Like if you have 10% of your greens are made up of this like vegetation that was contaminated with herbicide or whatever else, you can just limit the amount of that in your compost. And usually what I find is that same thing with the manure. Like you probably wouldn't want more than 10% of your total pile volume to come from a source that has these toxins in it. But there, bioremediation is happening in there. And my take on whether or not a compost is safe to use is looking at it under the microscope. And if there's a suite of biology there, then you know that they're not being suppressed by these toxic levels of atrazine or glyphosate or dewormers, and that it would be safe to use. But there are plenty of compost makers who will sell you compost without knowing that it will have an herbicide effect, because of the amounts of toxic chemicals that were on the feedstocks that went into making that compost. And people lose crops that way for sure. I get calls every year about people losing their whole crop because they spread compost that was had too much herbicide in it. Yeah, and killed the crop.
Kyle Moot was a victim of that, and then also,
Really?
yeah, also whoever that person was, search Vermont compost. God, it must have been 10 years ago. They had an outbreak. They used a bunch of feedstocks that had glyphosate, and they bagged up their compost. Now, Vermont Compost is a very reputable company. They've had like 25 years or something of solid business in the state of Vermont. Very, very recognized and recommended product. They had a rash. They killed a bunch of tomato plants, and they almost went out of business because of that one incident of spreading Roundup by adding feedstocks to a point where it was either too much or it didn't have the thermophilic time to help to bioremediate. But again, it's just one of those things, like on small levels, like Andie says, no stress, the bioremediation will happen. But if you've got excess of it, then either remediate it as a plant or set it aside and don't use it, because you just don't want it, or use it in small amounts.
It's all about the balance, right? Too much of one thing, even a good thing, is too much.
Right.
Yeah.
So the DVD that you were mentioning, Leighton, where can people find that?
All right, that's called The Symphony of the Soil. I'm pretty sure it's free on YouTube. I personally liked supporting them. I think it was $15 on Amazon. Goes back to supporting their work. I think they're going to try to do another more up to speed version of it in the future, and I hope so, because I love The Biggest Little Farm. I love Kiss the Ground. All these things are bringing awareness around, but they don't teach the same levels that documentary does. That documentary is amazing. As it's a bunch of goofy individual unpaid characters from all over the country and the world. I mean, they've got farmers from the UK. Again, they're all goofy. They're not paid actors and actresses, and it's really clean information for a layman person. Easy to understand.
Fantastic. So we've got a couple of minutes left and a couple of questions. So I want to fix the yellow leaves on my rhododendrons. Any suggestions, guys?
Rhododendron have a very, very special relationship with mycorrhizae fungi. They're called Iroquois. Not an easy fungi species to get. But if you, I don't know where you live, but I used to drive up and down the East Coast, in and around Pennsylvania, Connecticut. You'd see these incredibly super healthy groves right in between the highway, like right in between the lanes. Now, the lanes were far enough apart that you could get trees and advanced shrubs like that. But if you can't get that inoculant, go to a place where you've got incredibly healthy rhododendrons. Do a soil extraction. So again, don't be an idiot. Give as much as you take. Bring a 5-gallon bucket of good compost in there. Take a few different handfuls from a few different spots and always replace it with compost. I like putting a Band-Aid on a sore. You don't want to leave that stuff exposed. And harvest some, because that's going to be the right biology. It's going to be the right fungi to support that rhodie. Rhodies are also very acid loving. So if you're not appropriately fertilizing with an acid fertilizer, that too could be causing newt lock, which would yellow the leaves. Chemistry is probably the thing I least recommend in that situation. But if you're desperate, I think there is some good organic fertilizers specific for rhododendrons.
I don't know if you've ever used organic acids to influence pH, but I feel like that could be a good approach that's mindful of biology because, you know, you tend to see if a plant prefers growing in acidic soils, that generally means that it will prefer having more fungal biomass because fungi will produce organic acids like humic acid and fulvic acid. So if you want to directly apply humics and fulvics, I think you could do that. But yellowing leaves make me think it's low on nitrogen, so that could be a nutrient cycling issue, and a protozoa infusion could be really useful in that case.
And it could also be a newt lock. And I love what you said, humic acid. So TM8, TM7 from BioAg would be another good rescue. I mean, typically whenever I get hit by a client looking for a rescue, it's three things: fish brew, humic acid, and kelp. And those three, the kelp acts as a hormone for the plant to de-stress it. Humic acid acts as a peacekeeper in chemistry. Even if the chemistry is in newt lock and completely out of whack for whatever reason, that humic acid complexes things and calms that back down. And then, of course, the biology is the the other piece of that puzzle to take a plant out of shock or decline and start to get it to come back.
Now, I will point out one thing, guys, with the rhododendrons. If you didn't know, they're actually toxic to bees. So the less of them we have, it wouldn't hurt my feelings because I love bees. Just wanted to point that out. So we got one last quick question. Okay. Are grain-fed castings the best? So for the feed source for the worms.
Well, so here's the thing with vermicompost or worm castings is that they do tend to be more bacterial for people, and that's because a lot of people are just adding food scraps or some other nitrogen heavy input into the worm bins, and so that drives things more bacterial, and they forget about incorporating some kind of fungal food. And so I've seen people have a lot of great success in improving their fungal biomass among their vermicompost using oat flour, or oatmeal, just dusting that in there to supplement and provide a food source for the fungi. And I would imagine it kind of depends on the grain. I'll look to Leighton on this, but grain, seeds do contain quite a bit of nitrogen. So I find that they can actually heat up a pile sometimes, but they also contain really complex sugars that will drive fungi. So you kind of have to account for both of those effects. I don't know what you think of that, Leighton.
No, I think you're spot on. The only concern of grains is that they definitely will potentially raise the heat in the worm bed, and that could be seriously problematic. One of the things that I've had the best luck with is a spent mushroom substrate. It's got a lot of nitrogen in it. It's got a lot of fungal spores in it. So it definitely helps to drive it to a more fungally dominant worm castings. And I'm a big proponent of leaf litter. Some of the other easy to consume, more fungally dominant foods, and a little bit of grains is fine, but I wouldn't go grain heavy.
Yeah, and the same thing I've experienced, at least with the mushroom blocks in my area, they do have a seed hole in them. So I am also just careful because if I put too much mushroom substrate in a pile, it'll drive the heat just the same.
Oh yeah.
Again, it balances out because it has a carbon source included in it as well. But you do have to be careful so you don't overheat, especially in a worm bin.
Yeah, and again, the whole key to it is balance. Don't be a moron.
Bingo.
Diversity. Yeah.
That's why I put up more roots in the soil is one of the keys.
So this one cat that I always deeply respected, I met him down at Rodale. He at that time was the only person I'd ever seen fungally dominant worm castings. Nowadays we have Chandler out at Wormies producing some amazing shit. But the way he did it was he actually built a ring with hay bales right on the ground. And then he built a fungally dominant compost, so greens and browns, but he also grabbed a lot of leaf litter. Again, not from like stealing it from the forest, but like, road edges and stuff like that where the leaves had piled up. Where the leaves pile up, you get this amazing resource of, nematodes, fungi, spores, hyphae, you name it. And he'd build this little volcano in the middle of the hay bales, and he'd build these at the farmer's farm. And the farmers would take all the drops and rejected fruit or vegetables, and they just throw it at the volcano, and the food would all roll down between the actual hay bale and the base of the volcano and get trapped there, so that the worms could come in and feed and then go back into their compost at night. Oh my God, that shit was amazing. And he never did anything to it. Like, he'd have the farmer say, hey, if it's a little dry, give it a quick water, once a week. And generally speaking, the water coming off of the fruits and vegetables was enough to maintain all the moisture he needed, even in the hot summer down in Pennsylvania.
Cool.
Yeah,
Love
a couple
it.
tips for you there. Anyway, well, we're 6 minutes late. Andie, thank you so much for your time, sweetie. I really appreciate this with all the work you've got
Yeah.
going on, and so good to catch up with you. So excited for both our work with the DNA overlay of the soil food web, and really excited to introduce you to Maggie in the near future and have you guys on here to really do a deep dive on how soil morphology and taxonomy are an issue that we really need to start looking toward as also tools to fix the horrible problems that we've created as a species.
Yeah, I love that. Well, thanks for having me on. This was a lot of fun, and thanks for the questions that people threw out to us.
Yeah, please, audience, don't hesitate to use her as a resource. She's by far one of, if not the best, soil food web graduates I've ever had the opportunity to
Oh
work.
goodness. There's a lot of us out there, but I appreciate that.
No, she's the best. Don't listen to her. She's just being humble.
And we've got Maggie's actually on next week, and then we've got James White the week after that.
Oh, James is going to be
Sweet.
another bomb. Well, Ken,
Yeah.
as always, thank you so much for all the behind the scenes work that you and Lil do for this, and the production time and the energy that you guys put into it. Huge ups to both of you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Andie, if you want to stick around, we're just going to bounce off everybody else. Peace out. We'll see you next week.